Hey everyone, first we're going to do a review of the human reproductive anatomy and the path of sperm to fertilize an egg, and then we're going to get into the regulation of all of that, which includes hormones. So let's start with the male. So sperm then would be created in the testes by germ cells there that would have to undergo meiosis, which is two divisions to make sperm haploid cells, meaning they have half the DNA. Making of sperm is also called spermatogenesis. So this whole process takes about 70 days. So they have to be stored and matured for a while. So within the testes, there's also these coiled tubes, which this is called the epididymis. Notice that the testes and the epididymis lie in the scrotum or scrotal sac, which hangs below the body so that it stays a little bit cooler for sperm production than what body temperature would be. During ejaculation, then, sperm would travel out of the epididymis to the vas deferens, this tube that's going to take them to the urethra in the penis. So it goes up and around the bladder here, where then the sperm pick up the fluid that they'll travel in, which is a nourishing fluid called semen. That fluid is made by a few different glands. First of all, here we have the seminal vesicles. That's this one right here. There's two of those, but we're on a side view, so we can only see one. And then there's one prostate gland. Both of those help to contribute the semen, which would carry the sperm. Then enters the urethra and travels out through the penis. Now there is one gland missing from this picture, from what I can see, but on this drawing it is included. So it's this little gland here labeled as number 5. It's right underneath the prostate. There's actually two of them once again, but on a side view we can only see one. You can call it either the Cowper's gland or the bulbourethral gland. Its job is to send a cleansing fluid through the urethra before ejaculation, before sperm travel through there. And I like the word bulbourethral gland because it kind of reminds me what it does, that it cleanses the urethra. All right, let's go to the female. There we go. So we'll start with the ovaries where eggs are produced, also the main female hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Here's where basically all the eggs that a female has, they live there. They've been there since she was a fetus in her own mother. It's just that they're not mature yet, and they've only gone through one of the divisions to make them into eggs. They actually have to, again, just like the sperm, go through two divisions in order to make them haploid, but they're kind of suspended and immature. They've only gone through one division. They'll go through that second division after fertilization. So they lay here immature. They're going to need hormones to get them to mature. Actually, one will mature the most each month, and that will be the one that gets ovulated for that month. And there's about 1 million or so that a female is born with, and as she gets older, they die. So by the time she's in her 30s, there's probably a few thousand left. But that's okay. With eggs, it's all about quality over quantity. And then when she goes through menopause, then she stops ovulating. All right, so we see the different phases that an egg would go through. And these were not on our video the other day, but we should get to know them. So again, there's, at least at the start, millions of eggs in the ovaries, but they die throughout the lifetime. And they start very teeny tiny and immature with an onslaught of hormones each month. Some of them will start to mature. And so all these cells will be activated around the egg and will start bringing nutrients in. And the egg then in the middle will start to grow. So we get this little area that enlarges around each egg. That is called a follicle. So a follicle contains an egg in the middle, and the follicle gets bigger and bigger as that egg grows, as it gets more nourishment. And then finally, if it's the egg that is going to mature the most that month, it will be the one that ovulates, and it will leave that follicle. There will be little fringes on the fallopian tubes, which are right here, little like finger-like projections and cilia that help to swipe it inward to the fallopian tubes. That's called ovulation. And you'll notice what's left behind is an empty follicle. So that is called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is important because that's where estrogen and progesterone continue to be released to get ready just in case fertilization happens. After an egg is ovulated, there's only about a window of about 24 hours that it can be fertilized. So it will be in the beginning part of the fallopian tubes here. If no sperm meet the egg and fertilize it during that small window of time, then the egg basically disintegrates and dissolves back into the body tissue. Macrophages might eat it and such. It's just a microscopic cell anyway, and so the body takes care of it. But if it was fertilized, it would travel along the fallopian tubes as a zygote, going through mitosis, cell division. It's got to go from that single cell to like 100 trillion cells to make an individual. So it takes about 5 to 6 days traveling along the fallopian tubes, where then it reaches the muscular uterus, who has been preparing by building up the lining. And then it might implant into the uterus, into that lining, where it will have nourishment and cushion to be able to grow for the next 9 months, to go from the zygote stage to the embryo stage to the fetus stage and finally the infant stage. So we have the uterus, sometimes that's called the womb, and then we have, this is not labeled here, but the entrance to the uterus is the cervix. Normally the cervix is only open enough to maybe let a single file line of sperm through. But during when a baby is born, it opens up to about 10 centimeters to accommodate a baby's head going through there. And then we have the birth canal, or the vagina. All right, so there's our review of the anatomy of the male and female reproductive system. I gave you a few new words there, though, like the word follicle and corpus luteum, and I mentioned some of the hormones like estrogen and progesterone as I went through there. Now I'm going to take us through some notes on the regulation of the reproductive systems, and this is going to involve hormones regulating these processes in both males and females. So hormones are chemical messengers. Generally, they're either made out of proteins or lipids. Generally, the ones that are reproductive in nature are lipid-based hormones like estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Our chief gland in charge of this whole reproductive thing is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, remember, is in the brain, and it kind of serves as both nervous system and endocrine system regulator. It has about 12 different hormones that it releases, and one of the hormones it releases is called GnRH, which is also called gonadotropin releasing hormone. Got the word gonad in there, so it tells us that it's going to regulate the gonads, which that means we're talking about testes and ovaries here. So when it releases GnRH, it goes right to the pituitary, because the pituitary is right next door to the hypothalamus. So if I show you this picture of the brain, here's the hypothalamus right here, and then this sticking forward is the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus is going to release that GnRH. It doesn't have far to go, where then it's going to affect the pituitary gland. Now the pituitary gland has two hormones that it releases. and they're called FSH and LH, also called follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone. So both males and females have GnRH coming from their hypothalamus, going to the pituitary, and again, both males and females have FSH and LH coming from their pituitary glands. Although I will say FSH and LH are more named for what they do in the female than what they do in the male. So then our other glands that get affected by FSH and LH are the gonads. So in the female, that would be the ovaries, and in the male, that would be the testes. So it's kind of like a chain of events where the hypothalamus releases one hormone that affects the pituitary, that causes the pituitary to release its hormones, and then those hormones go to work on the ovaries and the testes. All right, and I bet you can guess what the hormones are that the ovaries release and the testes release. So ovaries release estrogen and progesterone, and testes release testosterone. So it's a chain of events, each hormone causing the next thing to happen. So I will also remind you that these hormones only affect certain parts of the body, and only if those parts have target cells that have protein receptors to receive those hormones. So those target cells with their protein receptors have basically a protein on their membrane that is shaped in a certain way that fits like a lock and a key into those hormones. So hormones will only affect target cells, ones that are made to be affected by them. So here's some of the changes that happen. So when GnRH is released by the hypothalamus and then goes to the pituitary and causes the pituitary to start releasing its hormones, puberty starts. For girls, it's about between ages 10 to 13 or so. For boys, it's sometimes a little bit later. So we get different things happening, such as in the males, the testes mature and eventually start making sperm. The voice box deepens, there's more hair growth, and skeletal muscle gets affected with the hormones to start making more muscle. Females, the ovaries begin producing mature ova or eggs. The menstrual cycle begins, the hips widen, and of course there's also hair growth in different places that they weren't before, same as in the males. So here's another diagram to visualize this. So let's imagine we've got the hypothalamus in the brain. We also have the pituitary. GnRH is our hormone release that affects the pituitary, which then causes the pituitary to release these two hormones, FSH and LH, which then affect the testes. So this would be for our male reproductive hormones. So what does FSH do to the testes? Well, it causes them to mature. And then it also will start to regulate sperm production or spermatogenesis. What does LH do to the testes? Well, it causes the testes to start releasing the male hormone testosterone. Now, a thing that I've also got here is that testosterone also acts as an inhibitor to GnRH, FSH, and LH. So I've got a line going backwards from testosterone to show how this is called a negative feedback loop, that the product of all of this actually acts as the inhibitor, which goes back and shuts this all down. So basically what the body is saying is when I have enough testosterone flowing around out in the body, I don't need to be making more. So the testosterone, when there's enough of it present, will shut down GnRH, which means then FSH and LH will be shut down, which then means testosterone will be shut down. So it's a negative feedback loop to help regulate the amount of hormone. So then when you use up your testosterone, now there'll be nothing shutting this down. And so GnRH will start up again, FSH and LH start up again, and then testosterone starts up again. So it really is a cycle. I know we usually talk about like the female cycle, but really there is truly a male cycle as well. So in the world of the endocrine system and reproductive system, when you have hormones that shut down other hormones, that's called a negative feedback loop. Negative makes it sound bad, but it's really not. It's just showing how you go in the reverse direction, that when you finally get testosterone, you don't need to keep making any more. So you shut it down. You shut down the loop for a temporary amount of time until you use it up, and then you start up that cycle again. So there's my key here. So remember GnRH, what that stands for, gonadotropin releasing hormone. FSH is for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH for luteinizing hormone. All right, let's take a look at the female reproductive hormones. So since we talk about the female cycle, I actually wrote this more as a cycle. So we're going to start here with FSH. Again, we still have GnRH released, which then causes the pituitary to release FSH, but I left the GnRH out on this one. So FSH is released, and like I said before, this is actually named for what it does in the female. So that stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So that means the ovaries will be affected by this, and they will start to stimulate follicles, the cells around the eggs, to start getting some eggs mature and get some eggs ready. It won't be all of them, just a few at a time. And so those cells will start getting activated and start bringing nutrients to the egg. So it starts to grow nice and big and plump and juicy. Got to have a lot of cytoplasm in an egg cell. All right, so that causes, if I follow my loop going around here, causes the ovary to mature. A follicle with an egg, actually it'll be more than one. So I drew an ovary down here with a follicle. That's the activated area around the little blue egg in the middle. I drew other tiny eggs who are not maturing at this time, maybe next month for them. So that follicle, once it starts getting active with all those cells, it starts to produce estrogen and progesterone. So we know these two as the primary female hormones. And as you make more and more estrogen, notice I've got this line going backwards with that little negative symbol. There's that negative feedback loop where estrogen acts as an inhibitor to shut down FSH. That way, that helps us so that we don't make too many eggs mature a month. Otherwise, we'd be having 100 babies at once, and that would not be fun. So we've got that negative feedback loop to ensure that there's only some eggs that are matured a month. So we shut down FSH for now. And we continue in that follicle to mature that egg and keep making estrogen and progesterone. Now, progesterone is known as basically the pregnancy hormone. Hence, it says pro, and then gest means gestation, like a pregnancy. So that's going to go to the uterus cells as its target cells to help get that uterus ready and maintain the lining in case we get a fertilized egg this month. Also, the estrogen helps with that. So estrogen builds and becomes at a maximum level. When it's at its maximum level, notice I've got a line going here. We get a little positive. This is an example of a positive feedback loop where you get more and more estrogen. It builds and builds and builds. And we get LH. All of a sudden, we've had some LH released already, but it like surges because of this estrogen buildup. And when LH surges like this, due to the estrogen buildup, we get ovulation. So there's the picture of that egg erupting from the follicle. Generally, this would be about day 14 or about 2 weeks into the cycle. So within this 24-hour window, this would be a time where pregnancy or fertilization could possibly occur in the fallopian tubes. If it doesn't occur, well, then we'll have to start the cycle all over again. But remember what I said before, now that we have an empty follicle, those cells are still active there. They're still releasing estrogen and progesterone. So this empty follicle, which is called the corpus luteum now, is a very active site, and this is where we're continuing to get estrogen and progesterone, which continues to build up that uterus lining and keep preparing just in case fertilization happens. If fertilization happens, then the zygote will implant into that uterine lining, will start growing into the lining, and will start releasing hormones of its own to let the ovary and the corpus luteum know that it's there. And if that happens, then we'll keep releasing estrogen and progesterone from the ovaries. But if nothing's there, if there's no implantation, then there's no signal that goes to the corpus luteum to let it know that anything is there. So the corpus luteum then will eventually shrivel, meaning those cells will become deactivated and will no longer continue to release the great amounts of estrogen or progesterone anymore, meaning there's nothing to maintain that uterus lining. There's no reason for that extra lining anymore because there was no implantation. There'll be no baby this month. And so that's when that lining is shed in the process of what's called menstruation. All right, so on that first day when menstruation occurs, that's usually what a female counts as day 1 of her menstrual cycle, because it's a visual thing. And so she could know, okay, this is day 1. It usually takes about 5 days to a week to eliminate that extra lining. But meanwhile, the whole cycle is starting again. Even though menstruation is happening, the whole cycle is starting again because there's no estrogen to stop FSH. FSH will begin to be released by the pituitary again, which means, once again, we're going to get eggs maturing in the ovaries, which means then again, the ovaries will start to amp up their estrogen and progesterone. Once again, we'll get an egg that is the most mature, and an LH surge will be ovulated at about day 14, and so on and so forth. The whole cycle begins again. An average female cycle is about 28 days, but individually it's different for all females. To find one who's exactly 28 days might be difficult because, again, 28 days isn't an average. So now I've got a video playing here. This is an ovary showing you a bunch of eggs that are maturing in the ovaries, and we can see the fallopian tubes here that are ready to receive an egg should it be ovulated that month. As you see, one of those actually becomes the most mature. We can see the egg in the middle of it there. All right, we're reminded about FSH is going to, when there's a surge, will cause that egg to be released. And we've got estrogen and progesterone coming from the ovary there. So we'll let that play on. There we've got estrogen shutting down FSH, but LH causes the ovulation to happen. So there it goes, swept into the fallopian tubes. So now we've got that small window of time, about 24 hours, where fertilization should occur right here in the beginning of the fallopian tube. Should there be sperm present, then fertilization may happen. And so we see there's a lucky sperm here who got to fertilize that egg. Meanwhile, the uterus lining has been building up because that empty follicle called the corpus luteum has continued to release progesterone and estrogen so that in case a baby occurs that month, the uterus will be ready for it. But usually that's not what happens. So the lining is shed over a period of about 5 to 7 days or so. And that becomes day number 1. All right, so now I want to end with, once again, reminding you what a hormone is, the chemical released by glands. Sometimes we call them chemical messengers. They target specific cells. The hormones that we talked about here in this lesson were ones that control the reproductive system or regulate the reproductive system. It was a bunch of different glands that released different hormones, but many of them were the same for males and females, although some of them named more for what they do in the female. We saw some great examples of the negative feedback loop, such as how testosterone is a negative feedback to the hypothalamus and also the pituitary to shut down GnRH and FSH. So you have enough of it already. You don't want to make too much of any one hormone, so it acts as its own regulatory system. Also a reminder that when hormones are released, they don't affect every cell of the body, only cells that have targets for them. So that would include a receptor on the cell membrane. Usually a receptor is made out of a protein on the cell membrane that would receive that hormone, which then would affect that cell to cause a change in it so that it would start doing whatever it would do, like making a hormone or starting the creation of sperm or the maturing of eggs.